Hello, viewers. Hello, listeners. Welcome to another podcast episode on the Impact Co podcast channel. Whether you're watching this on YouTube or one of the podcast channels like Apple Music, Google Play podcasts, as well as on Spotify, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your support. Now, not a technology episode this time. I've been prefacing all my episodes recently with the fact that we've just been looking at technology. It's been super topical from an AI perspective, from a Magnificent Seven perspective, from an earnings season perspective. This time, I want to broaden out that conversation a little bit more, because when I talk about information technology, it sort of hides or masks the fact there are actually a bunch of other equity sectors out there. Fact of the matter is, if we can understand equity sectors a little bit better, it enhances our conversation about stocks and stock markets quite significantly. So if we can add this to our dialogue, add this to our conversation, we can start to sort of expand our topics around the equity markets quite a bit more. Now, before I jump in, usual disclaimers, this podcast is for information and educational purposes. If you are looking to invest, you should seek financial advice if you aren't aware or aren't sure how to go about investing. And if I do mention any stocks, any sectors, any markets, I may be invested in those from a professional or a personal capacity. Okay, that out the way. When we talk about equity sectors, we're basically talking about buckets of the market. So let's assume we have US equities. So these are companies that are listed and operate in America. They're listed on American stock exchanges like the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ and the Dow Jones Industrial Index. We can bucket groups of companies into different sectors, and that helps us describe and differentiate different companies in different sectors. Okay. The best analogy that I heard someone say once when discussing equity sectors is take a toy box, right? You're going to have a section for action figures. You're going to have a section for Lego blocks. You're going to have a section for, crayons, right? If that's what you're putting in. And those buckets help you describe the different sort of areas of the toolbox or the toy box. And that's quite a cool way to think about it, because I can compare Timmy's toy box to Lila's toolbox by saying Lila has more crayons, so she's more artistic, and Timmy might have more cars, so he's more into cars. If we start to think about it in terms of other things, let's say I was comparing two cars to each other. If I put them next to each other, what are the descriptors for them? How would I start to differentiate them? Well, one might have a better engine, which gives it more power. One might have more torque that allows it to put the power on the road better. Those are all sort of performance-based dynamics or performance-based sectors for a car. You can then go on to more practical stuff like what's the load capacity? What's the ground clearance? Does it have roof racks? And that gives you sort of an understanding into the different segment of what is the storage capacity of this? We can go into handling and talk about steering, whether it's four-wheel drive, etc. Therefore, bucketing cars into different segments. So now we can compare a Range Rover to a Polo, from a performance perspective, from a capacity perspective, etc., etc. And of course, on price. Stock markets are exactly the same. And we have different stock markets around the world. We'll talk about why companies list in certain markets, why a company like Apple may be listed on different stock markets at the same time. We'll get to that. But in essence, the primary distinction between different stock markets is location. So we have US stock markets, we have UK stock markets, we have European, Japanese, South African, and usually we're trying to differentiate between where we want to invest our money, and that's largely a geographic question. So understanding equity sectors really allows us to understand where we might want to invest and why, because we can understand sort of the sort of best case for that region, for that country, because we understand what stocks are listed there and whether we like those stocks or not, whether we like those sectors or not. So just like the car example, it allows us to expand our definition a little bit. Now, in the next couple of episodes, I'm going to discuss specific equity markets. I'm going to compare in the first episode all the US stock markets to each other, and then start to move offshore and describe different stock markets like European versus American. But we have to get the sectors out of the way first. So in this episode, I want to describe the sectors in the equity market, and I'm going to use something called the GICS sectors, Global Identification and Classification Standard, GICS. It's a very specific type of bucketing that exists. Now, realize you can create your own sectors, and there's a bunch of different companies that create a bunch of different equity subsectors, right? I use, and the industry predominantly uses, the GICS weighting scheme or equity sectors, and that's what I'm going to describe today. I'm going to describe each of the 11 sectors, what are the biggest stocks in them, and what are the sort of drivers of each sector. So what are the sort of sub-themes or some-categories inside the sectors. For which market am I talking about? Well, this is where, instead of focusing on an individual market, I'm looking at something called the MSCI All Country World Index. That is an equity market that combines stocks from around the world. Developed market countries, emerging market countries, and then based on the size of the company, gives different weights. I've talked about market cap before in a few episodes on a couple of reels. We'll link that down in the description of this YouTube video /podcast, so you can go and check that out. The MSCI Equity Index uses a market cap weighting to determine which companies have a larger weight and which don't, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So we're talking about stocks from across the world, and in later episodes we're going to break it down per individual index and really get into the number of why in the US there's so many different markets, and how do they differ from each other. We'll get there, but once we understand the sectors, we can take it to that next level. Okay, MSCI World Index, 11 sectors, the biggest of which being information technology, which sits at around 20% in weight. Now, it's a sector that we know a lot about because we've discussed it across multiple episodes now. And as you might expect, there's a bunch of Magnificent Seven exposure in there. If you drill down into information technology and talk about some of the sort of sub-segments that exist inside, there's three predominant ones. It's semiconductors, software, and hardware. Those are the three predominantly types of companies inside. And if I say big hardware company in information technology, I'm not sure where your brain might go, but the biggest in that bunch is Apple. You might not think of Apple predominantly as a hardware company, not by that definition, but think about it. iPhones, iPads, etc., all technology, all hardware. So if you go into software, what types of companies we're talking about there? Well, the biggest by far is Microsoft. But if you think about all the software companies, whether it be internet security companies, whether it be companies like Adobe that deal with digital editing, other companies that handle software on multiple different levels for corporates, for individuals, they all exist inside the information technology sector. So software and hardware, I think, are pretty easy to understand. You then go on to semiconductors, and semiconductors we've discussed at length. It's all the components that exist inside the hardware that we use today that help them to compute, from CPUs to GPUs to RAM. All of those use semiconductors as their building blocks, and the semiconductors that exist in the MSCI World Index inside the information technology sector are part of that supply chain. So things like Taiwan Semiconductor and NVIDIA and ASML, stocks that we've discussed before, all exist inside semiconductors. So in that 20% weight in the MSCI World Index, we predominantly have those three elements: hardware, software, semiconductors, and that gives you a feel for the types of companies that are in there: Microsoft, Apple, Taiwan Semiconductor, NVIDIA, things like that, ASML. And those could be listed around the world. Remember, Taiwan Semiconductors is listed in Taiwan. We're working with the MSCI All Country World Index to describe the different sectors. So if I was talking specifically about the S&P 500, Taiwan Semiconductors would disappear from the technology sector because it doesn't exist inside a US listed market. Okay, so that's sort of the feel of how we're going to go through the other 10 sectors. Just tell you sort of what's in the sector in broad terms. So what are the biggest themes and components? And then what are the biggest stocks that exist inside? Some sectors are extremely self-explanatory. I'll actually just read the sectors to you now. So it's information technology, financials, consumer discretionary, industrials, healthcare, communication services, consumer staples, energy, materials, utilities, and real estate. So that's your 11. That's in descending order of size inside the MSCI All Country World Index. Okay. Now, you'll start to see that classification is important and how we classify things is important. I didn't mention some other Magnificent Seven companies in the list that I just quoted. So Tesla's not in there. Google's not in there, Facebook's not in there, Netflix is not in there. That's because as much as some of these are tech companies, they exist at a slightly different level. Let's think about Tesla as an example. As much as Tesla uses a lot of technology to do what it does, it is an automobile manufacturing company more than a tech company. That's where it sits inside this list of 11. It falls in consumer discretionary. We'll get there in a second. The social media companies like Google, Facebook, Instagram inside Facebook, those companies exist in something called communication services because they're sort of interactive media and they deal with how we communicate with each other. So you start to see the subtle nuances between sectors that you need to understand. And that is important. So IT is sort of your pure building block. IT companies whose primary directive sits inside information technology. I know you might think Apple could fit in something like consumer discretionary, but it doesn't because of the number of sectors that it operates on. Okay, what's the next biggest sector in the MSCI All Country World Index? It's the financial sector. And when you think financials, you should be thinking things like banks. And you're right. Banks, investment banks, those are the biggest segments. You've got insurers in there. You've got asset management companies in there. And you've got payment companies in there. When I say payment companies, I'm talking about Visa and MasterCard, the companies that facilitate payments. So you've got your sort of entire supply chain of financials, and we'll get to financials later on. This is why this conversation, how it's going to help us to build on to later. So banks, investment banks, those are pretty understandable. Insurers across the entire range of insurance, life insurance, general insurance, motor insurance. You've then got asset management companies like your BlackRocks and things, which do sort of passive investing, but you've also got actively managed companies. You've got advice companies, wealth companies also involved in asset and wealth management. You've even got private equity companies. Some of them are listed, which makes it quite an interesting space. So a lot of companies in there. The biggest stocks in the financials universe in the MSCI All Country are US companies. So it's Berkshire Hathaway, the company that Warren Buffett owns. Big insurance company in there, lots of different assets. It actually is quite a diversified company. I can spend a whole episode and more talking about Berkshire, and we'll get there. But Geico, the insurance company in the US, is quite a big asset that sits inside Berkshire. Visa is the biggest payments company in the world. MasterCard not far behind. JP Morgan, biggest bank in the world, US bank, but one that we're all quite familiar with. It has an investment bank as well as just a traditional bank. And then, of course, BlackRock from an asset management perspective. Those are the four biggest companies. So financials, I think, pretty easy to understand because we interact with financial companies every day. Most of us have bank accounts. Most of us have insurance of some kind if we own physical assets. And hopefully we have investments if we're listening to this podcast. Okay. Information technology, financials, third biggest sector, consumer discretionary. Now, the words consumer discretionary lead you to what type of stocks exist inside. Consumer, they deal with sort of end consumers like you and me. Discretionary, the things that they sell are not needs, they're wants. So in times of economic uncertainty, economic pain, we could give up those things. If we had to lose our jobs, it wouldn't be a deal breaker if we stopped buying these things. That's what a discretionary company is. And why we label it like that is because there's another sector called consumer staples, which is the opposite. It's needs. So inside staples, demand is pretty consistent because we need staples in our lives. Discretionary companies are more associated with wants. So what types of stocks are we dealing with inside discretionary? Bunch of retail. There's apparel retail, footwear retail, home building retail. I'll call out some names just now. We have automobile retail. So Tesla sits inside consumer discretionary. We have hotels and we have restaurants. And if you just think across the line items I spoke about, you don't necessarily need to buy clothing, especially not high-end clothing. You don't need to necessarily buy footwear. It is discretionary. Home buildings, you might not need to upgrade your home. You can delay the purchase of cars. You don't have to go to hotels. Restaurants are a discretionary spend. So all of those sectors lean towards discretionary. What are some of the biggest stocks in that sector? Well, you have Amazon, Tesla, and Louis Vuitton, if we're talking global. So Amazon, biggest sort of online e-commerce retailer, a lot of what they sell is discretionary. There are some staples in there, but predominantly discretionary. Tesla, largest automobile manufacturer in the world. Now it's happened very quickly. And then Louis Vuitton, which has grown significantly. It's the largest luxury retailer in the world. It's listed in France, but remember, we're talking about the MSCI All Country Index. here. So biggest French, biggest European company does sit inside consumer discretionary. We're going to I sort of talked about apparel retail, footwear retail. The biggest footwear company in there is Nike. The biggest apparel retail company is something like Inditex, which owns Zara, which most of you are probably familiar with. And if you think about hotels and things, Booking.com exists inside consumer discretionary. So those are the type of stocks that are all inside the consumer discretionary sector. Again, we're trying to just get in and out, understand what the sector is about. Next biggest sector is industrials, and industrials deals with everything that's sort of associated with business to business. So industrials effectively help other businesses do what they do. They provide the parts, the equipment, the manufacturing capability to allow businesses to do what they do. So consumer discretionary, consumer staples companies deal with end consumers like us. Industrials is very much an inter-business segment that deals with sort of business to business. And you'll see what I mean when I discuss some of the companies here. It's very large scale, very equipment based, manufacturing based, components based businesses that help other businesses to function. What are the four biggest components in there, or the four biggest themes from an equity perspective, from an investing perspective? There's aerospace and defense. So those are companies like Airbus and Boeing that create planes. You have defense companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon that actually develop weapons and arms that get sold to countries and certain private sectors. You have machinery companies that exist in there that sell certain parts and equipment, some at a very large scale. If you think of something like Caterpillar and Deere, which is selling things like engines and large machinery that's used in the building of a variety of different things that we end up buying at the consumer level, as well as sort of small component machinery parts. If you think of something like 3M, which sells a number of different smaller components that exist and that are used by a number of different companies. Rail is a very big part of the industrial makeup. So these are companies that own rail networks across countries, and this could be any country in the world, quite frankly. But when we talk about rail, the biggest companies do exist in North America. So they own the rail network that allow us to freight a number of things across the country. And that's super important because if you're, digging oil out in Canada, you sort of have to get it down to a port so that it could get out into the rest of the world then by ship. If you have a bunch of goods that are being, developed in Texas and need to move off into maybe further North America, maybe to the East Coast in New York or the West Coast in California, the rail network is going to facilitate that, because typically flying those things from point to point is going to be a little bit too expensive. So the big rail companies that exist are Canadian National Railway. That's sort of one of the larger ones. And as much as the name says Canadian, it's across North America, the rail network. And then I've discussed components and parts. That and machinery sort of fits together. So you can see the theme. I've discussed Caterpillar, Canadian National Railway, Airbus, Boeing. Carrier exists inside industrial. So Carrier sells a bunch of HVAC equipment, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning that goes into buildings that are being built. So they help, if you're building sort of a high-rise building, you're air conditioning, that Carrier is going to facilitate the air conditioning inside. You then have sort of elevator businesses like Otis, Schindler, Kierner, that's going to facilitate you putting in lifts and escalators in there. You're going to move things around the country using Canadian National Railway. You're going to get parts from the likes of 3M, WW Grainger, etc. All industrial businesses that facilitate other businesses doing what they need to do. So that is the industrials segment. Okay. Next biggest and quite topical is healthcare. We've been big proponents of healthcare for quite a while now. Biggest subsegments, super easy to understand. Straight out pharmaceuticals, so companies that make pharmaceuticals to then sell on. Equipment companies that manufacture equipment for labs, for hospitals, that sort of thing. You then have biotech companies, which are different from pharmaceutical companies. They're trying to solve a very specific need in biotech, and they're doing it sort of with a lot of R&D, things that haven't been cured yet. So they're looking at from a very big picture perspective, trying to cure some of the most difficult diseases in the world. So biotech, slightly different from pharma. And then you have sort of services companies like hospitals, dialysis centers, that sort of thing that just helps service different elements or different areas of healthcare. What are some of the biggest companies in the segment? The two biggest and the two most topical right now, Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk. Now, they do a combination of things, but the biggest part of their revenue right now is the diabetes franchise and the weight loss franchise. We'll talk about GLP-1 drugs in the next couple of episodes. Eli Lilly is US-based. Novo Nordisk is based out in Europe, and it sort of vies with Louis Vuitton for the biggest company in Europe, depending on who's doing better in any specific quarter. You've also got more traditional pharma companies, Merck, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, the COVID guys. You also got Johnson & Johnson in there, diversified across a number of segments. Those are all more or less pharma guys, but then you've got something like Intuitive Surgical, which we're invested in, that develops these minimally invasive machines that can go in and do surgeries for people. So very high-end equipment. But you also have companies like Stryker and things which sell your traditional beds and things. If you walk into a hospital and just look across different beds and things, you'll typically see some sort of Stryker equipment in and amongst the hospital. So that's healthcare, pretty easy to understand, very much based in pharma, but also the other elements of healthcare. You then have one of the newer sectors, and this had to be developed as IT started developing more and more, communication services. So traditionally, communication services had the telecommunications sector inside. In fact, when communication services didn't exist, it was just called telecommunications. And you had your traditional telecoms companies in there. So your Verizon, your AT&T, in the UK, it would be Vodafone. In South Africa, it would be MTN, Cell C, that sort of thing. But now that's expanded a little bit more with the rise of the internet. So the communication services sector was created, and we lumped all sort of interactive media in there. So now not only do we have telecoms companies in there, we have things like cable and satellite companies in there, like Comcast, or in South Africa, something like MultiChoice. We have the social media companies in there because it's a new way of sort of interacting with each other. We don't necessarily phone each other as much anymore, but we interact via social media with each other. So companies like Facebook, which owns Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, sit inside there. WhatsApp sits inside Meta. Now you have Google, which owns the search business, but also a large part of it is YouTube. YouTube is a social media platform. So big social media exposure. You also have things like advertising companies in there, movie companies, if you think about the likes of Disney or something like Comcast, which owns Universal. So everything related to content, how we share content, how we interact with each other, whether it be via phone, via social media, sits inside communication services, and it is quite a new sector. Biggest companies in there, we've already discussed it: Google, Meta, Netflix is in there now because it is sort of a content business. Disney, Comcast, which not only owns Universal, also owns a number of network TV and a cable network, as well as sort of fiber internet and things. So Comcast sort of plumbs the entire realm of communication services. And then obviously something like AT&T, also one of the more traditional companies. So that's communication services. We then move on to consumer staples. And remember, consumer staples is effectively the opposite of discretionary. It's consumer products that we need, not that we want. So the big themes that sit inside there are packaged foods and meats, so things that we sort of have to eat on an ongoing basis. Staples retail, like your Walmarts and your Costcos. In South Africa, it'd be your sort of ShopRites and Pick n Pays. Those companies have more necessities than, say, a Louis Vuitton or a Nike, which is your more discretionary stores, if we're comparing stores to stores. You have your soft drink companies, which are quite large: Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Monster Beverage. Coca-Cola, Pepsi are more staples companies than, say, Monster Beverage. There you go. You have your personal care and household products. So those are companies like Unilever, Procter & Gamble. In South Africa, something like AVI, which owns a number of different consumer branded products. A lot of these are non-negotiables in people's homes. If you think about shaving blades, nappies, things like Dettol and sanitizers, stuff like that, that's owned by Reckitt Benckiser. Strangely, though I think understandably, tobacco and alcohol also sit inside staples. Why? As much as they seem discretionary, they are generally always bought throughout cycles, regardless of what's happening with the economy. I guess that says something about the human condition, but companies like Diageo and British American Tobacco and Philip Morris all exist there. So if you think about any of your traditional popular alcohols, your Johnny Walkers, your Well, clearly I don't drink that much, but like your Cirocs, your Jamesons, your Johnny Walkers, Captain Morgans, all your large beers overseas, they all exist inside the alcohol segment. And in tobacco, all your large brands like your Marlboros, your Rothmans, your Peter Stuyvesants, that sort of things. In terms of where they sit in terms of companies, Walmart's huge in consumer retail, Costco too, which is more like a warehouse style macro type retailer, Procter & Gamble, Pepsi, Coke we've mentioned, Philip Morris, which owns Marlboro, Stuyvesant, Rothmans, and then Diageo, which owns Johnny Walker, Captain Morgan, and Ciroc, all exist inside consumer staples. So generally, things that you're going to buy, regardless of what's happening with the economy, sits inside staples. We then get into the smaller sectors. First one's energy, and it's actually pretty easy to understand energy. It's everything related to oil and gas and getting that oil and gas around the world. So it's not just the drilling of the gas, it's exploration related to gas, the transportation of oil and gas, it's the refining, the drilling of oil and gas. And there are a number of companies that sit inside there. So Saudi Aramco is the largest. That's the Saudi national oil company that listed a few years ago. So that's the largest company in oil and gas. But once you go down, it's all your more traditional companies, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, BP, that exist there. But we're talking about every part of the energy supply chain, from exploring the ground to see if there's energy there, to drilling it, to transporting it, to refining it, to actually putting it in people's cars or homes, whether we're dealing with gas or oil. Okay. Then on to materials, which is everything about mining, not oil. So anything that we dig out of the ground and use sits in the material sector. And that not only is things like your platinum, your gold, your copper, your iron ore used in the production of steel, but it's also things like chemicals get produced inside the material sector. Those also get mined and then refined into different chemicals. Large companies that exist there, something like BHP Group, whose predominant resource is iron ore that comes out of the ground and then gets used to make things like steel. Rio Tinto, also a big iron ore player. Sherwin-Williams, something like Glencore, which does a number of things, including copper, etc., but also has a trading business in materials and in different subsegments of materials. So if you're digging something out of the ground, it's typically going to be sitting in the materials sector. And like I mentioned, the sort of core resources, your what we call PGM materials, so that's your platinum, palladium, rhodium, which sits in PGM, gold, copper, iron ore, those are sort of your biggest resource companies that sit inside materials. Utilities, these are companies that provide you with a certain utility service. So utilities are things like electricity, natural gas, water, things that sort of get piped and plumbed into your home and get provided to you. In a number of countries, including South Africa, those services or utilities are owned by the nation, as in they are nationalized, they are not private. There are public entities sort of facilitated by government. But in a number of countries, especially in the US, you do actually have privately listed utilities companies, heavily regulated by government, because these are very important things. They can't sort of jack prices up whenever they want to, etc. Heavily regulated, but the private sector takes care of the need. So in South Africa, we can't invest in national utilities, but in the US you can. So you have electricity, gas, water, renewable energy. You can invest in companies across that spectrum in different parts of the world. If you take the US, for example, you can invest in some companies that facilitate very specific utilities, maybe in a renewable fashion, maybe in certain parts of the United States. So those companies are available to invest, and that is quite interesting. Very steady Eddie companies, as you might imagine. It's very much a staple, those utilities, but therefore they're not really going to shoot the lights out in terms of performance, because it's very steady year-over-year growth, and they can't jack up prices as much as you think because they are governed by the government. Okay. Last sector now, real estate. And when I often say real estate, people get really confused. They think sort of their home, and that's fair. Your home is real estate. But in terms of listed real estate, we're talking about way more than that. Probably some of the largest, especially here in South Africa, is mall real estate and office real estate. So the offices that we work in, the malls that we go to, are typically owned by companies that list on stock exchanges that you can buy. But when you go out deep into the world, and especially in the US, you get a whole range of different different real estate you can buy. So mall real estate, office real estate still exists, but you have telecom real estate, which is sort of towers. Companies own towers, rent out the towers, and you can buy the company that owns the towers effectively. You have data centers, which is a huge one now. Companies are buying up real estate specifically for data centers, and other companies, your large companies like Microsoft and things, are either renting or buying property to try and sort of facilitate and install data centers. So that's quite a big one now. Warehouses has also become quite topical because of e-commerce. You have to have warehouses around the country to have good e-commerce. So warehouse real estate's going up a lot. Malls and office are more your traditional real estate, and that theme is sort of slowing down a little bit and being taken up by data centers, warehouses, etc., as well as telecom, because we need more telecoms infrastructure around the world. You then have storage, which has become quite popular, where in large cities like New York, you're not going to have space for everything that you need, so you store some of it in like a public storage or something. When I say public storage, I mean that's the name of the company. And then you can sort of move things in and out depending on the season. And then, of course, healthcare real estate, super important, super topical. So that's sort of real estate that you can actually use to build hospitals, pharmacies, things like that. Or manufacturing capacity around pharmaceuticals. That is, in about 30 minutes, every single sector that exists in the GICS classification, as well as some companies and themes for the MSCI All Country World Index. There were 11 of them, from information technology all the way down to real estate. Move around the podcast if you want to sort of hear me talk again about one specific sector. As I go into different markets, the sector discussion is going to be slightly different in that some markets will have a higher weighting to healthcare versus IT versus financials. The companies listed in there are going to be very different. If you think about US technology versus, say, French technology, for example. So we can start to compare two cars sitting next to each other, like in my earlier example, and see which one we prefer for whatever reason. The descriptions around the sectors are pretty consistent. Those are typically what the sectors are going to be for any market. So we're going to be able to bucket companies into the different sectors and do really, really nice comparisons. The other thing that we can now do, and I'll probably do it in next week's episode when we talk about the S&P 500, the most topical US market, is how have these things changed over time? I can tell you technology, which is now a 20% sector in the MSCI All Country World Index, was a fraction of that 20 years ago. And the companies that existed in there were very, very different. So we can now start to chart what equity markets have looked like over time, which is very, very exciting. You'll see when we get there. But that's it. I know I run through them really quickly. 11 sectors and their companies to discuss can be quite difficult. So hopefully this makes sense. I'm going to put out a bunch of content like reels, shorts, TikTok videos, as well as sort of stuff on our stories and things to break this down a little bit more, discuss the different sectors. And like I said, in the next couple of weeks, when we start to expand on this and talk about the different sectors inside different markets and compare different markets, this conversation will be very topical and very useful. So you can always come back to this and reference this episode before you go forward. Hopefully you enjoy the episode. If you got to this far, as always, thank you for joining us on whatever platform you're listening to us on. The support's been tremendous. We really, really appreciate it. If you can, like, subscribe, follow, do all of those things, depending on the channel that you are. But yeah, we appreciate you as listeners and followers of our content. Thank you all again for listening. All of the best. Take care. We'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.